Speaker today is the author of the book, The Cannabis Premier. She's going to be talking about the myths and the facts about medicinal cannabis, as well as how to find the right dosage. Please give a big round of applause for author Ruth D. Fisher.
Hi, thank you for having me here. I got into cannabis about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I really knew nothing about it. I was brought in, my brother, he has MS, and he's experienced really bad chronic pain from a lot of different sources. And he's been through the medical system, and the traditional system has failed him in a lot of ways. And one of his doctors finally said, "Hey, maybe you'll benefit from cannabis. Maybe that might help." But the doctor really didn't know anything. Wasn't able to give my brother any guidance as far as what he should be looking for, what type of dosage or anything to take. So he had this interesting experience where he walked into a dispensary and saw the tremendous variety of products there, and pretty much realized that he had no idea what he was supposed to be looking for. So I'm an analyst and researcher, and I have a lot of experience in the healthcare industry. So at that point, he contacted me and he asked me to help him do some research to figure out what he needs to be doing here, what he should be looking for. So that's kind of when I started getting into the industry and reading about it and learning about it. Then at some point, my brother, he's an engineer, he came up with this idea on how to kind of create a technology to help get other users in his position who are very unfamiliar with the product, to help them better navigate the system than he was able to do on his own. So I started doing a whole lot of research then and trying to figure out, my nature is how do things work, and so I was really curious about cannabis and how it worked on the body. And in order to design the technology, I really needed to understand kind of how all the pieces fit together. So I did a lot of research, spent a lot of time. The world of cannabis is really interesting. It's really complex. What struck me is I've spent a lot of time researching different industries, and you go in and it's usually you can kind of put your arms around it. And pretty quickly you can kind of determine what's what and get a general idea of how all the pieces fit together. And in cannabis, I just kept reading, and I was like bombarded by all this information, and I had a really difficult time trying to understand how all the pieces of information fit together. And I'm an experienced researcher, and so I couldn't even imagine what other people were trying to go through to get through this and try and understand, is this something that's safe? Is this something that I would benefit from? So when I had done all this research to create the technology, my brother and I decided that we should put it in a book because we had both learned so much, and the book alone would help a lot of other people. So kind of the way I approach the industry is trying to understand, to admit it, I came in and I was kind of skeptical. I didn't really know that much about cannabis, didn't really know anything about the medical aspects, but just kind of dismissed everything. It just wasn't really on my radar. But I'd heard, I grew up in the age of this is your brain on drugs, and so kind of had this in my mind, this, gnawing feeling that, am I recommending to my brother and to other people something that's not really safe? And so I did a lot of reading, and I wanted to, figure out what the truth was. And then once I figured out what the truth was, I could go from there and figure out how to deal with it. But so, one of the biggest things out there, and I saw it in the newspaper again today, is that cannabis causes schizophrenia. And I kept, when I started looking at all the research papers, there's, literally thousands of research papers out there saying that, cannabis, especially for adolescents, it leads to addiction, drug abuse, it's a gateway drug, it leads to people to consume alcohol and these harder drugs, and it causes schizophrenia and just, all of these problems. And there's study after study after study saying this. And there's no real studies out there on people. There's lab stuff, people playing around in cells in a lab, but no real studies on people saying, well, there's actually good stuff going on. And normally when you read about, say, a regular pharmaceutical, they'll say, well, yes, it had side effects, but it also helped in these other things. And in the cannabis literature, they don't say anything good about it. And I was really curious about this. So finally, after a lot of reading, what I realized is, so it turns out that the federal government, the US federal government, is the largest provider of funds for research worldwide in science and medicine. And in 1937, when cannabis became effectively illegal, the spigot of funding dried up, and there was no more funding available for scientific research, except for NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and their mission is to study the causes and consequences of drug use and drug abuse. So you have this organization, and their specific mission is to understand the problems associated with using drugs. And these funds were available worldwide to researchers, and there was a real dearth, a real scarcity of funding available if you wanted to do it, to research it in a positive way. And so that explains why there's so many studies out there saying all this bad stuff. But that kind of begs the issue, well, they could be right, and are they right? And so again, it turns out, okay, so switching gears for a second, it turns out that there's a study out there that's been done a lot by a lot of different researchers, and it shows that on days when people eat a lot of ice cream, you also see a lot of acts of murder and violence committed. And it gets better, because on the days when people eat more ice cream, they eat it earlier in the morning, and the acts of violence and murder are committed later in the day. So from this, can we conclude that eating ice cream makes you commit murder? And this is the same idea of what's going on with cannabis, is they're saying that people who use cannabis also use other drugs, and they get into problems. And really, so in the example with the ice cream, it's more reasonable to think, well, maybe it's hot weather that's causing both things. That, hot weather causes people to eat more ice cream, and it causes people to commit more acts of murder and violence and get agitated. So the same thing with all the cannabis studies, they never ask the question, okay, who is this person and why is he using cannabis? So it's likely, it makes more sense, at least to me, that you're talking about people who are coming from troubled backgrounds, and they're looking for an escape, or they're looking for a way to self-medicate, and they're turning to cannabis. So they're looking to it as a reflection of something else that's going on. So it's reflecting what they're doing, it's not actually causing it. Now, as for schizophrenia, does cannabis cause schizophrenia? There's been a ton of research on this, and a lot of people still say, yes, in fact, this is true. Personally, what I find more compelling is the argument that people who are already predisposed towards schizophrenia, when they consume it, the cannabis will trigger it and bring on the onset sooner than it might otherwise come on. But in and of itself, it doesn't cause the schizophrenia. And what I find really compelling about that situation, or that argument, is that it turns out that most people who have schizophrenia, something like 90% smoke cigarettes. And they've discovered that nicotine in cigarettes, acting on your nicotine receptors, helps alleviate the symptoms associated with schizophrenia. So if they're smoking cigarettes to get some relief, it makes a lot of sense that they'd be smoking cannabis as well. So my conclusion is that really these are people trying to self-medicate, and they're self-selecting. They're a group of people who are more predisposed to try and self-medicate or find relief than people in the normal population. So cannabis is kind of a reflection of their schizophrenia, it's not a cause. So now what about the idea that cannabis causes lung cancer? So that's another interesting one. A lot of studies out there saying smoking cannabis causes lung cancer. And it turns out that most of the studies done, they're looking at cannabis users, but it turns out the cannabis smokers are also smoking cigarettes. And so you have to isolate the effect of the cannabis from the effect of the smoking cigarettes. So if you throw out all the studies that they don't control for this, and they're using people who both smoke cigarettes and cannabis, look only at people who smoke cannabis, then all of a sudden they can't find a causation there. They don't see that the cannabis smoking is causing cancer. And that's kind of interesting, because everyone knows that smoking is not great for you. It can be toxic to your lungs. It can cause a lot of problems. So the question is why aren't cannabis smokers getting these problems? Because they are smoking and they're getting toxic toxic effects from that. So what they think is actually the cannabinoids in the cannabis is counteracting or mitigating any damage caused by actually smoking. And so again, this makes a lot of sense to me, that when you look at, take out the studies that aren't controlling for the cigarette smokers, focus on the cannabis smokers. Are they getting lung cancer? And it turns out, no, they're not. So this is all, it's interesting to think about all the information that's passed around society and how wrong so much of it is. And if you dig down to the details, you can generally figure out what's really going on. So to continue on, another myth that comes out is cannabis it impairs cognitive development. And especially in kids, it causes their brains not to develop very well. So it turns out your brains continue developing until you're about 20 or 25. And they do have concerns about adolescents smoking cannabis. Your brain is still developing and it could potentially cause problems, although the jury is still out and they're still trying to research this and understand this better because they really haven't nailed it down. On the other hand, there are very clear pediatric uses for cannabis, such as epilepsy and autism and cancer. And certainly if you're dealing with a child who is so withdrawn and removed from the world because they're seizing all the time, the prospect of maybe perhaps generating some cognitive impairment is a worthwhile trade-off if you can have the child interact again and come back into the world and have some quality of life. And personally, I believe it's up to the parents to decide whether or not the costs and benefits of using cannabis and the potential risks are worth it or not. And that's their decision to make. Finally, people think that in order to use cannabis for medical purposes, you have to get high. And that's another myth. That's absolutely not true. Cannabis without THC in it, CBD is really popular right now. You can use cannabis without THC and avoid the whole issue altogether. But actually, I think cannabis is underrated in a lot of ways, especially now with the craze towards CBD. CBD is kind of getting all the glory. They're just saying that's the safe one. And yes, I give CBD a lot of credit from what I've read. There is a lot of benefits and a lot of great stuff going on there. However, there's a lot of really wonderful stuff with THC. Again, you still don't have to get high when you consume THC. You can take it at low doses in order to get the benefits from it without risking the potential side effects. And the good news is if you do overdo it, and if you do get some of those side effects with paranoia or anxiety, it's completely self-limiting. It will go away on its own. All you have to do is wait it out. And it causes no permanent damage. And so really the trick with cannabis is to start low and go slow, as everyone says. You want to start with doses that are, say, less than 2 milligrams THC in order to see how you deal with it and then kind of work your way up, and then you minimize any of the risks of the bad side effects. And then kind of stepping back from that position, when you're talking about cannabis and you're talking about risk, especially from a medical perspective, really, for my brother, for example, he's on some really gnarly drugs and they cause really gnarly side effects. And they still can't really, fully help him. And he's turning to cannabis because it can provide relief. And if you say, well, if you weren't using the cannabis, what are the alternatives? What are the risks and benefits of the other stuff that you would be using if you weren't using cannabis? They really suck. They're really bad. And so it's not a question, does cannabis have side effects? It's how do those side effects compare to the other drugs that you would be using instead? And as for the people, and these are the people who have these really nasty conditions and who are suffering these effects, who are the ones who would be taking the higher doses. So say from MS, from cancer, from AIDS, the wasting syndrome. These are people who are taking high doses because they have really serious problems. And so, they're willing maybe to take the risk to get the benefits. And as for people who say, whoa, I'm just in it for more wellness things and I want it to help me sleep, I have a little joint pain maybe, and I don't really want to risk any of the side effects, well, they're going to be taking lower doses anyway, and so they're naturally not going to come up against the same type of potential for bad effects. So really the question there to be looking at is not what are the problems associated with cannabis, but what are the problems associated with cannabis relative to the potential alternatives that you would be using if you didn't use cannabis. Okay, moving on to finding the right dose and looking at the different products. There's an issue here, and it took me a really long time to figure this out. I grew up in a medical family. My dad was a private practice physician, and I know, kind of what doctors go through. I was always a real big fan of the healthcare industry. They had people in the traditional healthcare industry, the science researchers, the people from pharma, and most of the medical doctors out there. They're raised in this environment, the healthcare system with all its perspectives on how to do things right and what the proper standards are. And for medications, kind of what the proper standards are go back to the early mid-1800s with the germ theory of disease. And that's when they first discovered, germs, and germs can contaminate things. And that's when they started making this effort to purify everything. And they thought that, in modern medicine, we cannot settle for anything lower than this gold standard of pure medicine, because what we want to do is we want to make sure we're looking only at the particular ingredient that we want, that it's purified, there's nothing else in there that it's going to taint it, and that when we go from dose to dose to dose, we're getting as standardized an effect as possible. So the people from the medical industry, this is the view they're coming from. And so all of the pharma versions, with some exceptions from GW, which is now doing some whole plant extracts, but all the medications coming from the healthcare industry tend to be purified, isolated extracts. In contrast, you have this whole other group of people and this whole other set of research coming more from the cannabis industry and the herbal medicine industry and that whole tradition, which looks at herbs in whole plant form as medicine. And it says, nature made these things, and there's like 500 different compounds in a cannabis plant. And they all work together and they all enable things. And so again, stepping aside for a second, I'm a baker. I love to bake. I make a lot of cookies, and what's kind of amazing to me is when you make cookies, they all start with flour, sugar, and butter, and vanilla. And then, so you adjust the different ratios of these things, and then sometimes you want raisins, or sometimes you want chocolate chips, or whatever, but they all work together to provide the cookie. Some of them provide the rising, and they provide chewy versus cakey, and they provide the consistency, they provide the flavor, and they're all working together. And to think of like extracting only the flour, that's not going to give you the full cookie experience. So I look at cannabis and all the different ingredients in there, especially the terpenes and the flavonoids are up and coming. They're all working together to enable the cannabinoids. And when you strip out just the cannabinoids, say THC, you're essentially disabling all of its enablers. And what convinced me personally that I believe that the whole plant effect is better than the isolate effect is two things in particular. One is the entourage effect, which we've already heard from, that says you want to use all the different compounds together. And as a matter of fact, they've done studies where they've given people isolate and they've given the same people whole plant extracts. And I think in almost every case, the people prefer the whole plant extract. They get better effects, they need lower doses, and they suffer fewer side effects. And so also in there, in the entourage effect, you have CBD and THC working together, and they're really this power couple, and they're really amazing together. And when you have CBD with THC, CBD increases the rate of absorption of THC, which means you need to take lower doses. So which means that you're less predisposed to any bad effects, say paranoia or anxiety. It also, they enable each other. And so just the two together provide so much more benefits than any one alone. The whole plant effect enables the entourage effect. But there's another really, really interesting thing that I don't really hear people talk about that I thought was really fascinating in the literature, and that's that they do all these studies and they have people, especially with the pharmaceutical versions where they're the isolates and the purified compounds, and they give people a dose and they either find it doesn't work or they get really bad side effects. And what it turns out is that when you have a purified sample, you get this very, very narrow range of potential dosing where you can get an effect. So say, for example, you really need around 10 milligrams, and you can get 9 or 10 or 11 milligrams, but if you undercut that region, you're not going to get any effects, and if you overshoot the region, you're going to get really bad effects, which means you have to get really precise dosing. And given that each person's different and each person's going to take a different dosing, it's going to be really difficult to help each person find that sweet spot where they can really benefit from cannabis. On the other hand, when you switch over and you use the whole plant, they find that you no longer get this narrow range of dosing, that it becomes a much more positive relationship where you get more gradual benefits as you increase the dose. And of course you can still overdo it, but you no longer are constrained to this very narrow region where you have to limit yourself in order to be able to get the effects. So it was those two things. It was the entourage effect and this dosing range that convinced me that whole plant cannabis is the way to go. So now moving on, how do you know which dose is right for you? So you have a particular medical condition and you're coming into cannabis and you want to know, what do I take and what am I looking for and how much do I take? And there's going to be a couple of different things that you're going to want to look for. So first is each person has an endocannabinoid system, and each person, their system is relatively unique. So they react to THC differently than other people. So if I take a 5 milligram dose of THC, I'm going to have a different effect than if he takes it, because he just has a different body system. And there's some people who are very sensitive to it and others can tolerate more. So first thing you want to know is, what is your particular tolerance? So again, you start low, you see how your body reacts, and you start increasing the dose until you find something that's right for you. The second issue is your particular medical condition is going to make a difference, because they're finding that if you have, say, cancer versus depression or anxiety or PTSD or pain, each of those conditions is going to want a different combination of compounds. Some are going to want CBD, CBDA, THCV, CGN, or any of those. In particular, terpenes. Linalool is better for sleep. Caryophyllene is better for inflammation. And so, depending on your disease, you're going to want a certain profile, a combination of ingredients. And that's the entourage effect, and that's going to depend on your particular condition. They've also found, interestingly, that not only do you want to have, say, CBD and THC together, but you want to have them in a certain proportion, say a 1-to-1 proportion or a 3-to-1 proportion for your particular illness. And then the last thing, so as I said, that CBD is very popular right now, and people like it because they don't have to worry about the whole THC and psychoactive thing. So it turns out that really, if you're dealing with any sort of pain, people start out on CBD and it works for a while and then it stops working, and so they up their dose and it works again, and then it stops working, and they up their dose and eventually it stops working, and then they add in a little bit of THC and they get effects again. And when they finally find their sweet spot of a combination of CBD and THC for pain, they eventually get to the point where it works and it continues to work. And they don't see that same problem that they have with CBD, where, well, it did work for a month, but then it no longer works. So really, if you have pain, they've shown that THC is really important to relieve pain. So again, the combination of factors that will be important for determining what you as a particular individual want for your condition, it will depend on your particular tolerance to THC. It will depend on your medical condition and what combination of different compounds you want that they have shown will best address your particular needs. And you want to look at what ratios they have found of THC to CBD that you think that they think will help you best with your condition. And again, there's a lot going on here. We put together all this information into charts and graphs and explain it all, and it's all in the book. And so if you're interested more in this, our medical cannabis primer covers all this information. Before I end, there's two last things I want to point out to be aware of. One is the biphasic effects of cannabis. The cannabis is kind of, other things do this too, but it's kind of weird that if you take a low dose of cannabis, very often you'll get very different effects. In fact, the opposite effect as you get if you take a higher dose. So for example, if you take CBD at low doses, it tends to promote alertness. But if you take CBD at high doses, it promotes sleep. So you can imagine, I know there's a lot of people out there who are using CBD for insomnia, and if they're afraid of it and they're taking very small doses because they're afraid to take it, they're going to end up waking themselves up instead of helping themselves sleep. So you need to be aware of these biphasic effects. And the last thing to be aware of is CBD in particular, but also the other cannabinoids tend to increase the rate of absorption of other drugs that you're taking. So if you are taking other drugs and you start taking cannabis, you want to be careful and look into any potential drug interactions. You might have to decrease the dosage of the other medications that you're taking. And thank you very much.